Ah, we're live. You had a little sip of tea there, I see, Mark. Good afternoon to everybody. You're all live, and welcome to our Daily Maverick webinar for the launch of Mark Shaw's second book. Your first book actually was disturbing enough. Mark is the director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Crime. It's based in Vienna and has 6 offices, but Mark will tell you a little bit about the Global Initiative and how it's led him to do this extraordinarily important work in South Africa. Mark's latest book, I think those of us who've been involved in writing about the guns to gangs story have known for quite a while that it's a massive story, that in some way it's been lost in the headlines of the political palace politics of the ANC. But this story really plays itself out daily in the lives of people, particularly in the Cape Flats, and is actually so shocking that it's almost very difficult to follow how this was allowed to happen and how it came to be. But we'll be talking through this in a minute. In 2016, it was Brigadier. Oh, there we go. We've got, that's who you are, Mark. You hold a PhD from Wits, taken up various positions in South African government and civil society. And there's your biography for everyone who wants to have a look at it. Just to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this event, and to let you know that the book is available at the Daily Maverick shop. Now, in 2016, Brigadier Qwabe Prinsloo, who had been a brigadier in the South African police for over 30 years, a firearms legislation expert, and there at the time, head of the police armory, was sentenced to 20 years in jail after a very protracted and long investigation. And it's subsequently emerged that Prinsloo was the kingpin in removing arms and weapons that were surrendered to the state, or old police guns and various other weapons, and selling them onto a middleman who sent them on and sold them to the gangs of the Western Cape. Those of us who know here understand the low-level, or not even low-level, high-level warfare that goes on in Cape Town's townships, and which has been escalating for a long time, over a period of time. And Mark and others and the police who investigated this made the connection between those guns and the rise in crime and the war. Mark's book spoke, unlike those of us who do these stories, to over 200 people, I think, involved in the gangs to gun, lawyers and various other people. So this is a really comprehensive, deep dive into, I think, one of the most shocking stories of post-apartheid South Africa. I just wanted to read one little piece from Mark before I go in, where the numbers of fatalities as a result of these guns that were fed to gangsters is 1,066 murders between 2010 and 2016. And Mark writes that these numbers of killings mean that Prinsloo's work is without doubt the deadliest single crime to have been committed in post-apartheid South Africa. And I think that's a very important way to frame this story. And also you frame it in the book as a larger piece in the puzzle of state capture. Mark, welcome. Thank you. Give us a little bit of background about the Global Initiative, this particular story itself, how you came to it, and then we'll take it from there.
Marianne, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to speak to people in Cape Town and around the world. The Global Initiative is a kind of think tank on illicit markets, if you like, and it's doing 3 things. So analysis, which you can see on the website. It's a platform for discussions about responding to illicit markets, and then it has a fund supporting a range of community groups around the world. So it has 6 offices in different places around the world, including in South Africa, covering East and Southern Africa. And as you know, the Daily Maverick covers some of the research, etc., on its website. So the idea was to build a civil society organization which looked in detail, more from a strategic research perspective at issues of organized crime in particular, and to fill a gap in the discussion which isn't there. And it's grown quite big now with around 80 full-time staff, quite a large membership, and a large number of funded projects, whether it's the Mothers of the Disappeared in Mexico, to groups in Asia, elsewhere in Africa, the Western Balkans, etc.
And your focus has been particularly, I think, the Western Cape and the Cape Flats. The gang's first book, Hitman for Hire, of course, covered South Africa, and was disturbing enough in terms of the ability of South Africans to easily procure someone to kill someone else for a relatively small fee. But this particular story, tell me why you found it so important and why it hasn't been or hasn't featured as strongly as it should and must do in future.
When I was working on Hitman for Hire, which, as you know, was really spurred by, in fact, it was a book that didn't begin about Hitman. It began about attempting to write about organized crime in South Africa generally. But to write about organized crime in South Africa, which is so diverse, I felt that I needed something which tied it all together. And at UCT, where I was at the time, we started a number of colleagues to collect data around assassinations across different sectors of the economy and the rise of hits for hire, the sort of political economy of hits. And so the Hitman book came out of that, trying to understand how paid assassination had become part of the South African criminal underworld, but also had seeped into the way of doing business and politics and the like. And when I was doing that book, which included interviewing hitmen and police officers and the like, of course, the idea of state arms on the Cape Flats came up, and it was before the Prinsloo arrest. And in some ways, I dismissed it because it seems so far-fetched that the state would be arming the gangs. But gangsters and gang bosses said there were police guns circulating. And in fact, it was one of your stories in the Daily Maverick, Hell is Not Hot Enough, I forget the title exactly, plus other coverage that, and I added a paragraph or two on Prinsloo in the book, sort of at the last minute, to show where firearms had come from. But I thought that this was a story that needed to be told, partly because it was told in, there was fragments from the court appearances and in the press, but there was no complete story, which to me was shocking, just the simple volume of guns that had been transferred into the gang environment, and that these guns had effectively come from the state. And so the sort of all the paradoxes and contradictions within that process, and that began what I hoped would have been a shorter journey, but turned out to be quite a long one, as per all books, I suppose, in terms of trying to tie down the nature of the case, what happened, the general guns to gang phenomena, and the book is a result of that.
Well, some would argue with you that it's, or the state would probably argue with you that it's not themselves, it's elements of people or employees in the state. But if you look at the extent, I mean, you estimate that about 9,000 guns found their way, many of them still out there, some of them stockpiled. So they will say that it is individual members of the police and others, but the sheer quantity and numbers points to a hugely a systemic failure in the systems, and then a deep corruption of police at station level in terms of issuing licenses and various other things. But I think in order to just set the terrain for people who might not be living in the Western Cape, and why the Western Cape in particular around gangs, is if you can just give us a short background around forced removals and how people moved from the colourful District 6, where there was crime, into the Cape Flats, communities scattered and societies torn apart. And the establishment then, of course, the apartheid government were responsible in many ways, and we know this, for facilitating or turning a blind eye towards the mandrax trade and the establishment of certain I suppose key gangs in the Western Cape. If you can maybe look at those two key gangs, and then what starts happening once ordinary gang members are able to arm themselves, because having a gun as a gang member used to be a difficult thing and an important thing to have. Not everyone had a gun, but now everyone has a gun. So the history a little bit, and then what the guns have done, and then we'll get into Prinsloo himself.
The first point to make is, and the work of the Global Initiative, for example, in Central America and elsewhere, gangs always evolve out of a particular political economy, social circumstance, and that's very much the case in the context of South Africa. The breaking up of communities, and out of that, other forms of organization emerging, which evolve over time. what I think is important and that's well documented now in a number of PINOC and a number of other studies, which I think are important from colleagues at UCT over the years. I think what happens over time is, as is elsewhere in the late 1980s, things begin to change, partly because the state, not only in South Africa but elsewhere, still retains quite strong control over organized crime, because the state needs gangs, works with them in some cases. The same applies to the liberation movements. Post 1990, globally, but also here, there's some very important changes in the nature of gangsterism. And then the next key period is just after 2000, the sort of the growth of the global economy in very dramatic ways. And each of these are tipping points around the formation of organized crime and gangsterism, both in South Africa and elsewhere. And so you need to see the sort of evolution from what you might say are social causes to a more hardened form of organized crime now. And I think it's really important to make the differentiation between ordinary gang membership and then a sort of leadership cadre, which are harder core organized crime figures, almost impervious to state action. Again, the position looks similar elsewhere in the world. They, in this case, talk to each other. They are in contact with each other very often. However, the gangs themselves often engage in turf wars between two consolidated alliances, as the book describes. That's not always the case, and it's very messy, and there's conflict within the alliances and amongst different gangs. But broadly, that's the position. And the nature of gangsterism, or the economy of gangsterism, or gangs on the ground, is very similar everywhere in the world, and certainly in the Western Cape. And you can think of it as a kind of triangle between recruitment, so getting particularly young men on board. You need people, you need soldiers, you need representation, and different levels of recruitment. So hardcore to people that are associated with the gangs, perhaps less directly. And I put some numbers in the book that come from the Global Initiative's own count in the Western Cape. Then the control over turf, so territory, the importance of controlling territory. And linked to territory is, of course, the sale of drugs. So territory is a if you like, a framing of how you run your economy. If you have guns become absolutely key to defending that triangle, to holding territory, to recruiting members because of the symbolism of having a gun, being armed, the coolness around it, and of course, by controlling territory with guns, to increasing your hold over the drug trade. And from around 2007, and as the book explains, in fact, there's quite solid evidence that the state was leaking guns before that, and that Prince Lua knew that. It wasn't the same quantities as there had been in the past, as there had been when Prince Lua began, sorry. But from around 2007, large consignments start to arrive on the Cape Flats through an intermediary who's now standing trial. And that begins to transform gangsterism, or gangs, in a number of ways. Firstly, gangs, as you said, always had access to firearms from burglaries or theft from state sources, etc. But guns were very precious. They were looked after. They were issued out. If you lost a gun, gang members report you could be badly punished. Suddenly, there's gun inflation, and it becomes a kind of arms race, as the book describes, between these different groups. And the title, in fact, Give Us More Guns. The intermediary who was acting, if you like, as the flow through for Prince Lua, the Americans come to him and say, give us more guns. So in the beginning, he's selling, but then a number of channels opened up because it becomes really urgent for opposing gangs to get guns. And into this just becomes this enormous flood of guns. And as the book says, far more than the 2,400 that in court Prince Lua has said that he sold. And just to really emphasize the point, and then I'll stop, the guns coming, there are three categories of guns that are being transported. The first are decommissioned police guns. And so the book begins with the story of the Z88, which was a gun made in it's a copy of the Beretta, which was a police gun made in the 1980s and then decommissioned, or some of them decommissioned as the police started to replace that category of guns. So these are guns made locally, and they have a cachet, which was for me very interesting because they were police guns, and the gangs wanted police guns, and the sense that by having a police gun, you had greater authority in a gang environment. So that's the first category, and the book includes a photo of those, and you can see those guns. News 24 had a picture of them seized the other day. You can see Z88s. They often have the little ring which was attached to the lanyard of police officers, so they're easily identifiable. The next category is guns that are handed in amnesties. So, from 94, et cetera. So these are guns that people have handed in because they thought the state would protect them and reduce the number of guns on the streets. And the third is guns that are in evidence stores, so the SAP 13 stores, which were then transferred into the armory. So a combination of all of these guns are then sold on in bulk. And out of that comes a gun market where gang bosses, and there's some pricing in an annex in the back of the book with the team. We worked quite hard to understand what the prices of guns were and who was making money. And people selling guns said it became more profitable than drugs, and it was easier. And so there are still stockpiles of guns. So we are really reaping the whirlwind, and the book tries to tell this story, Marianne.
Right. I mean, I just wanted to just also, frame that the economy, its territorial economy, has moved through to the nighttime economy in the Western Cape. It's been there for a long time. And the sale of drugs to upmarket areas. And often what people in Cape Town don't know is that the gang bosses actually live in their little nice leafy suburbs, but maintain links everywhere else. So in a sense, every part of Cape Town has been sectioned off and parceled out to various gangs. But let's talk about the interesting thing about Prinsloo himself. I mean, Brigadier Prinsloo is a cop with the Sapps for over 30 years. He is at a certain point when firearm legislation is being renewed or looked at or changed. He's the go-to guy in a way. People see him as this expert. I mean, it's not a very high rank as a brigadier, but he stays working in the Sapps as an expert on guns and ends up at the armory. Tell us a little bit about this man, because I think what's interesting is that we have, and I see you try and skirt it in the book, or we have this former apartheid white cop in the Sapps, and we do know that the Sapps has its own issues with past members, and I mean, that was early in the 90s. But Brigadier Prinsloo is still there. He doesn't have any particular ideological outlook, but he sees a moment, and it, in a sense, as you say, becomes the biggest crime in post-apartheid South Africa. Talk us through Brigadier Prinsloo, what his role is in the Sapps, how he comes to exercise that, and then how he gets found, because that's the other very, very brilliant story in the book, is that, for people to understand there are good cops and there are clever cops, and they're not all angels, but they manage to detect something bad's happening. So tell us about Prinsloo, because I think that's quite an important and vital part of the story.
Thanks, Marianne. You promoted him, in fact, so he was still a colonel, and
that's right.
Promoted him to a brigadier. In fact, that's, as the book outlines, that was one of his motivations, because he was frustrated. He felt, I have been told by good sources, he felt he should have, in fact, been a brigadier, and in fact, another officer, a black officer, got that post, etc. He's an interesting character, and there's a chapter on him and his motivations. I think the first point which you've covered is that he was in a very small environment, and you hear this again and again speaking to people. In a very small environment, he was the SAPS gun expert. He knew a lot about guns. He had been part of the legislation. There's a quite eerie quote which I use in the book, where he speaks, I think, to News 24. He says, hand your guns in the amnesty, he gives numbers, etc. And this is just about at the time that I think he's starting to sell guns on. So I sense, and it's quite hard to understand his actions, actually, because they appear to be unbelievably cynical. He he tells people around him that he sold the guns on, and interesting, because I was working for the UN at the time and doing a lot of work in Somalia. He tells people around him initially a story that falls apart, that he was selling guns for anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia. And that the reason that he could sell illegal guns was, of course, these were private security operations operating on the ships. When ships passed through the area, they could just throw their guns overboard. But it turns out that that story is nonsense. And he, in a sense, had been, I think, with another officer called Naidu, who's a very interesting character in all of this, also recorded in the book. He looks around for a market for bulk guns. He may have sold a few initially. And it's not exactly clear how he decides on it, but it becomes, he targets the Western Cape gangs. Now, it's quite a good target, actually. The gangs are very hungry for guns for the reasons I've described in this triangle. If you can access guns, you can change your business model, or you have levers of power in relation to the competition. But Prinsloo, interestingly, wants his hands clean, and he quite rightly, as the intermediary finds out, he quite rightly doesn't want to deal with the gangsters. So he finds an intermediary. He may take the guns down to Cape Town in bulk, but no gang boss I spoke to had met Prinsloo. They had dealt with the particular gentleman who's the intermediary, who Prinsloo knew from Vereniging. They'd been in a shooting club together, et cetera, et cetera. So this begins around 2007. Now, that's ages ago. And he begins selling over an extended period the bulk supply. I would think he may even have forgotten how many he sold. And the gangsters absorb all of this. There's also evidence that, in fact, he may have started selling first in KwaZulu-Natal. And two interesting footnotes. In today's Daily Maverick, there's a story about a gun retrieved in Hanover Park from the current amnesty, so handed in perhaps in December or January, and is already back on the streets. And the first point to make is that when you look at the numbers, guns were already leaking before the bulk supplies by Prinsloo, but probably at lower numbers. So the systems are essentially broken. There's good evidence to say guns are leaking. Prinsloo knows that. And
just at this point here, let's try and explain to those who've tuned in, what is the system supposed to be? How do you track and trace? And I see Johan van Lachenberg has asked a question, saying he's been wondering what sort of a manufacturing level, some sort of trace and track system that cannot be introduced now. But I think that system was already existed in Sapps. So what went wrong? The guns were handed in and the Z88s were decommissioned. They were all meant to go to the armory, I take it, from where they would be destroyed in some sort of furnace. Okay, so tell us a bit about that, I think, because people need to understand the chain of where the leak might, or the leaks did happen.
I mean, I will keep it relatively simple. The guns are recorded in a system, but because Prinsloo is such a prominent expert, my understanding from interviews is actually there's very little oversight over what he did. And I think this comes back to the point that you were raising, Marianne, that actually it's a systemic failure that we like. And of course, the police likes to say, look, there's a few bad apples. And yes, we've got this bad apple. But they have never acknowledged the systemic failure around the documentation of the guns, etc., and then the fiddling with the system and their release. Now, I've spoken to people who have been at where guns are destroyed, as well as heritage inspectors who have gone and looked, and the chaos that is described just suggests that the systems are not working effectively, and from that, undeniably, guns were extracted. So one of the things that the book argues for is at least an independent mechanism of auditing gun destruction. Now that sounds sort of, why can't we leave the police to do it? But I think there does need to be a check because guns are gold for organized crime, and in essence, the state who's meant to be, of course, the point is so obvious to make, but shocking in itself. The state is meant to be ending organized crime, that is essentially fueling it at the same time through systemic failure. Nobody, apart from Prinsloo and Naidu, has resigned or lost their job or been suspended around this. So, and in fact, the police, in my experience, are very reluctant to discuss it. And even Commissioner Patakili, actually in the Sunday Times, made to his credit, made a mention saying we often pick up police guns in a sort of question and answer session that he had. But that's really unusual. If the police sees guns and they have a photo, and you can tell they're Prinsloo guns actually in the photo by how they've been ground, they will never say these are previously police guns we are retrieving. So one of the points of the book is to say, look, we actually need to acknowledge, that the guns came from the armory in this way.
Which, of course,
how many, frankly.
It kind of opens the state up to a class action, I suppose, which is why no one has been, people have been reticent. But I think what's interesting is just that Prinsloo was also able to work on the guns at the armory. There's enough equipment and machinery for him to, perhaps listeners know that he erased the identification marks on the former police guns, which were Z88s. And I think what worries a lot of people is sort of the gun owners feel they're being disarmed or being made to adhere to very strict gun legislation while the state is leaking arms to criminals, and it's a very untenable situation. And I do think it will at some point need to have much more a bigger national discussion about it. But Mark, tell us a little bit about how Sapps themselves come to understand. Of course, all of us see the rising crime, the body counts are in the mortuary. Obviously the police who are not corrupt are realizing something big is going on. But it only seems to be picked up around about 2012. I'm not sure when. Can you just give us a little bit of background into how it becomes, how we become aware that actually the state is arming criminals in the Western Cape?
I mean, it's a very interesting story, and I think it says a lot about policing in South Africa, and I genuinely hope that comes through the book. And that's that a particular constable in Mannenberg called Lufti Eckstein picks it up in his information network. And he's an interesting character because, as so many policemen on the Cape Flats, he operates sometimes in a grey space, given who his family are, etc., etc. And he finds evidence of state guns or gets information, at least from an informant, of the sense that there is bulk supply. Now, that in itself is a surprising fact, and as a policeman, you may misbelieve that, or he goes to he doesn't use the chain of command, which I found interesting. He uses his network, and his network is to Jeremy Veery, who many people on this call will know, a prominent police commissioner, then general within the system, who is widely and well known in the Western Cape. And he goes there because he doesn't trust the chain of command, and that information is then used because Veery puts out the word, let's start collecting guns that we find and try to test them. And interesting in all of this is that because there are so many guns by this time, and there are YouTube videos and stuff on Twitter that anybody can watch, and if you're on the Cape Flats and there's a gang fight, gangsters start to throw their guns away. When the police come there, and so there are more guns to look to be seized, and those guns are tested, and they are linked piece by piece back to the armory in Vereniging, and there the link to Prinsloo is made. It does raise issues about why it took so long. I'm not sure whether that's fair or unfair, frankly, given that it was a relatively surprising fact. But it does say that police guns were being seized earlier, but really the sort of penny dropped in around 2013. And from there, the investigation goes I have my own theory, which the book explains, based on interviews, etc. Through Naidu to Prinsloo, the sense that guns were going to KwaZulu-Natal, and indeed Jeremy Veery and Peter Jacobs, again, a prominent police officer who's much in the news in recent events, and I think many people on the call will know, also look at the leakage to KwaZulu-Natal. And there's an interesting case now, which is not in the book because it was too late to put it in, around a fellow called Padiachi, who allegedly was doing the same thing. And indeed, I spent some time in Durban trying to follow this link, did it go to taxis, etc. And the book then transitions into the issue of private security. But Z88s were also, with markings, were also being seized on the streets of Durban. And there was clearly a line from Durban, the long connection between gangs in Durban and Cape Town, of guns in that direction. But having worked around South Africa, guns were seized in Johannesburg, in Nelson Mandela Bay, so it's not only the Cape Flats, where, of course, the largest volume of guns went, but around the country.
Well, also, I mean, as you mentioned in the book as well, when Jeremy Veery and Peter Jacobs sort of get to KZN, they find some of the taxi bosses in a prominent family, politically connected, literally has a militia of security guards or security personnel, all with arms that come from the armory. So the extent of Prinsloo's crime, as you say correctly, has actually completely changed the face of crime in South Africa and Southern Africa, and how we deal with it. There's a question here from someone which is quite important, because some of the guns, as we know, come from the armory. Some of them come from police selling them themselves. So they say they go home with a gun, or they've been robbed of their gun. So there's that. This question from Michael McLaughlin, he says, the state is obviously a major supplier of firearms to gangs. Do civilian firearm owners play a significant role in the illicit firearm trade, whether willingly or unwillingly? And what measures can be taken in terms of firearm control to prevent this? And I think that's quite a good question at this point, while we're tracking where it came from, the conduits, and where it goes, and how civilians themselves feel, well, I'm handing in a gun, how do I know it's not going to be passed on to the gangsters and sold?
I mean, the question, guns to the underworld, I mean, there are two, I think you could argue there are two sources. The state, well, first point to say is that before the state became a source, there were arms caches earlier, guns flowing from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, etc. Some of those sources dried up, hence the requirement to look for bigger bulk supplies of guns. The second source is, of course, in burglaries, so the leakage from the illegal, from the legal sector into the illegal. And of course, that's also a source of guns for the underworld. But I think a number of important points need to be made, and based also on interviews with people in the so-called underworld. Firstly, in the underworld gun market, bulk supply is really important. So if you're stealing, 2 or 3 guns from burglaries, etc., that's not bulk supply. What you need is large numbers. Hence the robberies by gangsters on military bases, etc., etc. I think private security companies who have semi-automatic weapons, etc., are also particularly vulnerable, and that's also a discussion to have. So the targeting of bulk supply, and this knowledge, presumably, and the book has an earlier chapter on this around I think, problematic police figures about guns lost, and the fact that some police stations, much more guns literally were lost than others. So some police stations, no guns are lost, so in others, guns are lost. And you can almost sense this is clearly a management issue, but it's also some knowledge develops about where you might be able to buy a gun from the police system. And so a significant number of guns are going missing before the 2007 period. And it's very hard to do the calculation. I've looked up on the small arms survey and then on the police's own figures of missing and lost guns, and it's around 10%. That's not the Prinsloo guns. So there's some more detail in the book around this. The second point to say is that police guns are far fewer police guns are retrieved than civilian guns. So the figures are also in the book, and I did the calculation. So if the police lose a gun, it literally disappears into the underworld. In my view, a fact much more likely that it was sold, whereas civilian guns are in some ways much more likely to be recovered. That's also possible because a civilian might lose them and then find them in, I don't know, granny's cupboard, etc., and then go back to the police and etc. But it's a much higher figure. So you've got these pools of guns. The book really focuses on the state leakage. And I must say I do that deliberately, partly because the state has a responsibility to look after its property and not fuel additional gun violence. But this, of course, feeds into the broader discussion around gun safety, gun control, the new gun legislation, et cetera, of which the book does cover, because I think it is a crucial question.
And I think it also speaks to the politicization of Sapps. At the moment, we see terrible instability in the leadership, a lot of it to do with politics and not much of it to do with actually policing on the ground. And there appears to have been a complete loss of focus because something as simple as tracking a firearm, which you would think, with IT and with supervision and with oversight, you wouldn't have any leaks at all. So as you say, it shows to a complete systemic breakdown of the Sapps. I just wanted to find out from you, sort of, Sapps IT systems, do they play a role in the ability of members to be able to dispose of weapons illegally? Is there, apart from the firearms registry, as you say, what are the gates? Where are the keys and the gates around firearms?
In my view, talking to lots of people, they are really there partly because take the Central Firearms Registry, of which is a chapter there. The systems are both electronic and paper. There's a lot of pressure on it, which leads to pressures for corruption. And I think the overall point to take, in my view, is that there's a series of big systems failures underway in the police now. And this is partly a reflection of a failure of management which has been developing over time, a politicization of the police. And in my view, it's the sense that the police has become very reactive, quite militarized, without being proactive. And the guns case is a very good example. Getting guns off the streets and destroying them and absolutely securing them is a critical crime prevention measure. You can go to as many community events, or when policemen are shot, you can make as much political noise as you like. But if you don't take the systemic preventative steps, you become part of the problem and not part of the solution. And so I think this is all. There's a series of mounting systemic bureaucratic challenges within the police, so within crime intelligence, within the systems, within evidence. I mean, much of this has been in the news, partly around, as the book also covers, a particular company and others. And so instead of IT being a solution, IT becomes a point of contestation and, of course, of corruption. And this points, I think, to the hard, more general work that needs to be done. And what's interesting for me, at least, and the book tries to draw that out, is in the case I've recounted, a constable speaking high up the hierarchy to a general he knows, people don't necessarily go through the systems because they don't work, because they don't trust them, etc. So the bureaucracy, as I say in the book, maybe it never fully functioned. The police, having also worked in the department myself, the police, the wider department, it's big, it's unwieldy, it's hard to manage, has always had challenges. But those challenges seem to me now to be coming to a head, and they are largely unacknowledged at a leadership level, in my view, at least.
So we have Prince Lou, and we have him, sentenced to 20 years, and he gets out on parole a bit earlier. Nobody tells us this. I mean, the other thing is I was so surprised that the commissioner at the sentencing of Prinsloo didn't go on national television, didn't go and say congratulations to the small group of police led by Varian, Jacobs and others for doing this. There was absolutely no pride taken in the fact that this one of their own had been caught. But I do believe that Prinsloo has become a state witness, which hopefully, and I'm not sure how much you know, will lead to a wider scope of where weapons went. I mean, if you look at military bases and other places where Prinsloo could have sold it to, do you expect the Prinsloo trial, when that happens, to blow open further where the state itself is implicated? I do think Prinsloo is going to be giving us much more shocking evidence than we already know.
Marianne, to be honest, it's hard to tell. I think he owes it to us as South Africans, frankly. And he got, as you say, a much shorter sentence, and his life is in great danger because, of course, if he's removed, he is the key source of evidence, him and Naidu. I think his evidence is largely targeted against two people who are alleged to be involved. Lahir, the intermediary to the gangs, and a fellow called Alan Raves, who's more of a heritage, a slightly different case. They will all be tried together, probably only next year. And the case has been very, very slow. I won't go into the details because in the case of Lahir, the defense has called for the dockets to show the links between the guns and murders. In the case of Raves, it's a slight, he's made the argument he shouldn't be part of this broader racketeering case in simple terms. The Western Cape High Court has rejected that, so the case as a whole is going ahead. I think Prinsloo's evidence will be targeted at these two guys, but there's a range of criminal figures. Because he wasn't directly engaged with gang bosses, I think there may be a limitation to how much he could expose, unfortunately, in the wider criminal economy. And that's where the Central Firearms Registry cases, which the book also covers, are important. So we need to see this all as a spectrum. The Prinsloo case, and then the set of false licensing or corrupt licensing around two prominent underworld figures whose trials are coming up in the coming months. Those are also critically important. At least one of those individuals is also allegedly involved at obtaining large consignments. But the evidence will probably be difficult to draw together. So the corrupt licensing cases around the Central Firearms Registry, where Colonel Kinnear was killed, so another link in the sort of network around guns, becomes absolutely critical. And I think we need to, which the book tries to do, we need to understand all of this together. It's not worth seeing just the Prinsloo case on its own. We need to look at the nature of private security, the arming with semi-automatic weapons, the controls around that, the taxi industry, as the book explores in KwaZulu-Natal, and the nature of the sort of private militia which have developed. I mentioned several private security companies with particular reputations, and then the arming corruptly, but in principle legitimately, with licenses of people with criminal records, or any simple Google search would find them listed as powerful members of the underworld. So all of this has to be cleaned up together. All of this is linked, and all of this is key to reducing violence and the power of organized crime in South Africa.
I think just to, there was one of the questions earlier on about Charles Kinnear's assassination and murder. And for those who might not know, Charles Kinnear was a member of a section commander of the anti-gang unit and was investigating corrupt Sapps officers who had been issuing licenses, gun licenses, to various underworld figures, and they identified certain police stations up in Johannesburg. But as Mark says, the networks extend across corrupt cops and also into lawyers. I mean, we've seen, you know, as you mentioned in the book as well, that the gangs themselves begin to, I think, use lawyers not only for their legal help, but in order to, I suppose, in a sense, stash their money, hide their guns, and do everything else. And we've had, just talk to us a little bit about the legal fraternity and what's happened in the Western Cape. And so far, I think 2 assassinations, 1 attempted assassination on the legal, on lawyers, which places further pressure on law enforcement and on the justice system to in any way hold these people account. And the lawyers in themselves, corrupt lawyers, we're not saying they are, but generally you need to be relatively bent to want to work with gangs and not just represent them, in a sense, which is what happened to some of these lawyers.
Yeah, the lawyers case is interesting, and actually interesting in the wider work of the Global Initiative, because lawyers become facilitators for organized crime figures, and the career trajectories of some lawyers who do that are interesting. And as you know, the opening to the book covers the murder of Hassan, a particularly prominent criminal lawyer in the Western Cape. And the story globally, but also in South Africa, is often very similar. You know, people start out young, they need work, they make a linkage to a organized crime figure or whatever, and next, over time, almost all their work develops around a particular criminal fraternity. And they may hold, as is alleged in the case of Hassan, they may hold trust fund money for organized crime figures. So they become part of the family, although they are never fully trusted. And the challenge for an individual like Hassan, as the book spells out, is that he may have had clients on the opposite ends of the sort of gangland spectrum. His skill is partly potentially his ability to have corrupt linkages with the police, because what gangs want is a lawyer who can get members out of prison. And to get members out of prison or out of holding cells it often means having a corrupt relationship at local stations, etc. And so lawyers in different ways, and I think to be fair to them, it looks different in different cases, get dragged into this process, and it can become very, very dangerous. And in a sense, there are, of course, several theories around how Hassan was killed, but the sense that the extracting of revenge on lawyers and the targeting. But in those cases, those are individuals often pulled almost directly into the criminal economy. The boundaries have started to disintegrate, partly because how their work has evolved over time. And internationally, there are several other examples of this, whether it's in Europe, for that matter, or Central America, or the Balkans. So because lawyers, and of course, the right to defense, none of this that I'm saying undermines these arguments. But what happens when criminal economies become strong is that particular lawyers pick up the same consistent cases, and the book looks at some of the issues and the complexities that people in the legal fraternity function in. But all of this targeting of lawyers, whether or not they are bent, and then the targeting of police officers, Kinnear, the threatening of magistrates, all of this is very much consistent with the environment in which organized crime becomes very powerful. You just have to read, I don't know, the Central American, Italian literature. It's just so clear how this develops over time. And it absolutely has to be reversed, partly through exposing it. I think, hence the book, but also, of course, the work journalists do and others to shine a light on this, because one of the issues that organized crime figures, they like attention, but on their own terms. And my point is, you know, so on their own terms, being interviewed, for example, you know, I think there's important questions about how to report on issues of organized crime, make sure there's a systematic overall picture. Again, I'm not saying I'm doing it perfectly, but that the book tries to do, to piece together the lots of individual traumatic incidents. There was a story, I think 2 days ago, of a 4-year-old shot. This constant drumbeat of violence, but the drumbeat of violence is the result of a series of systematic factors, of which guns and the organization of organized crime is part. And to try and get at that, Marianne, is I guess the argument I'm trying to make.
Well, I always find it quite odd that there are interviews with these I suppose that people put them in inverted commas, underworld figures, and that they contact journalists and send them SMSs and emails. And I think from where I came from in the old days, you don't do that. You talk to the good cops and the lawyers, but you don't in any way have tea with a gangster and allow him to set out, his worldview. You're quite correct. And I think that there are other issues here. Your book is beautifully written. I mean, it also reads like a page turner. So I'm quite jealous of your capacity to take us straight into a spot in a place the night her son was killed. You're able to reconstruct that really in great detail, as well as so much. So the book is I think, deep with good writing and great statistics and various other things. I've just got a question from someone before. I see we've got not that much long left, but there's a question here from one of the viewers or watchers about the role of arms dealerships in illegal activities. If you could just maybe talk to that. We could talk for 2 hours, but we won't be able to. So arms dealerships, what's their role in this economy?
I mean, there's no question that arms dealers or arms dealerships also contribute, because they, particularly when the economy is tight, and the book quotes a particular case where Prince actually helped advise the Hawks, but also on the other side was allegedly advising the arms dealer. The case in KwaZulu-Natal is also an arms dealer. But like the police, there are good arms dealers and bad arms dealers. And the arms dealers are critical parts of the broader economy around firearms. The buying of ammunition is a key issue. The provision of advice to prospective buyers is a key issue. The argument I make in the book, and so the answer to the question in the chat is yes, some arms dealers have historically played a role, and that's been documented. At the same time, there are arms dealers who want to operate legally and who feel challenged and threatened in the process. And I go through the issue of ghost stock, where there's allegations that the CFR add guns to arms dealer stocks without them knowing, so that they can hide. It's complex to explain, but they can essentially hide or create a paper trail for firearms. My view is that you need these people to bring about more effective and safer gun control, that you absolutely need to prosecute the corrupt individuals. And as we're drawing to a close, it's an important point to make. The firearms legislation of 2004 was having a real impact in the early 2000s. And there's this classic South African Medical Journal article, which I quote, saying, where have all the guns gone? There's far fewer gun injuries, etc. And then it spirals up, and you look at the Salt River mortuary figures. It's just the majority of people, bodies being examined there are killed as a result of firearms wounds. So the system was working, but then its implementation got broken. And I think there's really a strong argument for building a consensus. So a couple of points here. Building a consensus amongst the broader groups around the gun discussion. I think Parliament has a very important role to take in bringing those people together and kickstarting the system again, to get out of the courtroom, as I say, these constant court battles, to get away from the idea that we are having an American-style gun rights debate. The Constitution and the Constitutional Court has ruled very, very clearly in South Africa that it's a privilege and not a right to hold a firearm, that it is governed by regulation. So to build again a consensus, yes, it's arguably a fragile and often bad-tempered consensus, but it's one that needs to be achieved to reduce the number of firearms in society, and the state needs to take a lead in reducing, of course, the leakage from the state, but also building in viable allies in the sort of broader, let's call it the gun fraternity.
I suppose also in civil society, when it comes to the number of children who've been wounded and injured and who's lost their lives as a result of the state. I mean, we know what life is like in the Cape Flats, and we know the faces of those children, and we know the disruption it causes to lives. And it as you say, it is incredibly shocking that Sapps have not made any apologies for this, that it's almost been swept under the carpet, that two of the cops involved in, I suppose, the major investigation, which was Project Impi, I think, or Operation Impi, are now themselves facing various challenges within Sapps itself. So it's very worrying for ordinary South Africans. But what's important is that we're able to write about it, that Prinsloo was caught, that a new discussion needs to happen. And perhaps if a class action does get picked up against the state, that might, be enough of an incentive for those corrupt members of Sapps and others to think twice about doing it. I just wanted to show the cover of your book for people who need to do it. We haven't been able to cover everything that's in this book. We never are with these webinars, but I do think anyone who would like to understand what has happened to crime and the violent nature of it and why it's happening really needs to read this book and understand it, and the shocking understanding that some cop from the past, whatever his psychological makeup, that for me is just such a essential part of the story, Mark, that this man who was bitter and twisted for whatever reason then sows such chaos and mayhem, aided and abetted by so many others, is what is so shocking to me. But for people to know that there is going to be some focus on law and legislation. We've got about 3 minutes left. Where do we go with legislation, and how do we make sure this doesn't happen again?
I mean, the book makes a couple of recommendations. I argue for an independent audit of guns that have been lost. I honestly think the firearms registry should be removed from the police and run by by a civilian body. Again, these are challenging points to make because it means, again, the possibility that implementation could be subverted. But I honestly think there's an argument for providing much greater oversight over the issue. So the whole cycle, the issuing of licenses, the counting of amnesty guns as per already a gun missing from this amnesty, the audit of destruction, and the building of a more cohesive group amongst everybody in achieving greater safety to monitor and to implement the legislation that we have. To really emphasize the point, Marianne, and just to leave that, I hope, with people, guns are essential to organized crime. The guns are essential to creating criminal governance. It gives power to bodies external to the state. Controlling guns is key to reducing our homicide rate, but also to reducing the threat and power of organized crime. There's an enormous number of guns on the streets. They need to be seized through better intelligence and investigation, etc. But no other policy targeted approach would do as much good, I think, as reducing the flow and getting those guns that are out there illegally off the streets. And so, if anything, I hope the book is and the Prinsloo case, perhaps more importantly than the book, is a reinvigoration of that discussion and that focus.
Mark, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, and thank you to there was over 200, I think, people subscribed to watch us, and I would recommend you all get the book. I think what we take away from this is that while there are these really incredibly bad people who don't think twice about their actions, there are people within the system who stopped it. So I think, and it took too long and there were too many casualties, but for us always in South Africa, I know we always do this because otherwise we can't live here, is to understand that there are people who are extremely aware of what is done and that the state needs to take responsibility. So thank you for your book. I would recommend everyone read it, as well as Hitman for Hire. Thank you for your work. And also just to congratulate those cops who do a good job, who often are under terrible pressure. So thank you, Mark, very much, and for everyone else for coming, and for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this. And I suppose all I can say to everyone is just stay safe and out of harm's way. So thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you.
Bye-bye.